Thanks so much for joining us on this Sunday. Both Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump, as we mentioned, in Kuala Lumpur today for the ASEAN summit to pitch their Southeast Asian counterparts on trade. Trump and Carney are not scheduled to meet right now, but Carney says Canada is ready to resume negotiations with the U.S. whenever Trump returns to the table.
The government of Canada stands ready to build on the progress that we had been making in our negotiations, our discussions with our American counterparts. It is the sole responsibility of the government of Canada to have those discussions with the United States, and it's the best way forward. And as I say, we stand ready.
Trump ended those trade talks with Canada in response to an ad out of Ontario that uses the words of Republican President Ronald Reagan to criticize Trump's signature policy, tariffs. The ad has continued running through the weekend, notably during the World Series, just last night, in fact. Ontario Premier Doug Ford says it will be pulled from U.S. networks as of tomorrow, but here's part of the ad.
And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer.
On top of the end of the trade talks between the two countries, Trump also announced that he would be raising tariffs on Canada by 10%. The president didn't elaborate on when these tariffs would take effect, what they would be applied to, but suggested it was a response to what he called a dirty play by the Ontario government. Here's what Trump said before he left for Asia.
Canada, they did a crooked ad. They knew it was Ronald Reagan loved tariffs. What they did is really dishonest. And I heard they were pulling the ad. I didn't know they were putting it on a little bit more. They could have pulled it tonight.
They're going to pull it Monday.
Well, that's dirty playing. But I can play dirtier than they can, you know?
U.S. Senator Tim Kaine has put forward legislation in the U.S. Senate that would force an end to some of Trump's tariffs on Canada. If successful, the legislation would end the national emergency that Trump declared using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, as it's called. The legislation passed in the Senate last April when 4 Republicans broke ranks to vote alongside the Democrats. The Republican-led House of Representatives was set to vote on it, but it was never taken up. Now, Senator Tim Kaine has brought the legislation back to the Senate in an effort to revive it and keep the pressure on the White House. Tim Kaine is a U.S. Democratic senator representing Virginia. He sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Hello, Senator. Nice of you to make the time.
Absolutely, Rosemary.
I guess I'm going to start with what has unfolded over the past day or so with the president now terminating all trade talks with Canada over what he says was this anti-tariff ad run by the province of Ontario in the United States. What is your reaction to that news?
Well, it's just one more example of super childish behavior by the president. The ad was a very fair ad, recounting Ronald Reagan talking about why he doesn't like tariffs. Now, tariffs have a place. Canada uses them, and so does the United States for narrow and specific purposes. But the idea of these just sort of global tariffs on everybody with no strategy is foolish. And Ontario chose an ad featuring Ronald Reagan talking about why these kind of broad-based tariffs are foolish. And Donald Trump, who's so petulant, lets an ad make him mad and terminates negotiations. But that won't last. We have to get back to the table to talk not only about the current tariff back and forth, but even the bigger game of what do we do with USMCA, which was a Trump success from his first term in terms of finding a negotiation and improvement of it next year. So I think this is a little temper tantrum that a toddler will have and it will blow over. But it's embarrassing for the United States that we have a president who lets an ad rattle him so deeply.
The ads are going to be paused as of Monday. They've been airing during the World Series, but they will be paused as of Monday. What do you think Canada can do to get him back to the table other than just pause those ads?
Well, I think that's smart. Pause them after the Toronto games 1 and 2 in the World Series. But Congress is acting on this next week, and then the Supreme Court the following week. So Congress next week will take up a resolution that I filed with Senator Amy Klobuchar, Rand Paul, Mark Warner, and others to terminate the Canada IEPA tariffs. Those aren't the only tariffs against Canada. The president has imposed tariffs under something called Section 232, but the IEEPA tariffs are significant. And we're going to have a vote in Congress to terminate them. We had a vote in April on the same resolution. We got every Democrat plus 4 Republicans. But remember, that vote happened before the tariffs had bit into Americans' pocketbooks. They had just been announced. Now America has lived under these tariffs, and we've seen it hurt our small businesses, hurt our farmers, hurt prices for everyday goods, building supplies, food, medicine, energy costs are up. So I think I'm going to get more Republican votes this week to challenge these foolish tariffs against Canada. I'm also having votes on the tariffs against Brazil and the Global Liberation Day tariffs. And then the following week, the Supreme Court is going to have a hearing on a very important case about whether the president can use the IEEPA statute to impose tariffs at all. So look, the president can be petulant, but the facts and the economic chaos are sort of closing in on him. And I think that will get the president back to the table with Canada.
But in terms of what you're trying to do, are you hearing different things from Republicans now because of the impact they are feeling in their states? Are they also starting to question why the president is doing this?
Absolutely. And I think the president blow up over this ad will make them even more nervous. So when I challenged the Canadian tariffs in April, and under this IEEPA statute, you can renew your challenge every 6 months. I had a number of Republicans tell me, I see what you're doing. I generally agree tariffs are bad, but you're making a prediction that they're going to really hurt the economy. And I want to see whether that prediction bears out or not. You know, I make some predictions that turn out to be right and some that turn out to be wrong. But the tariff negative impact on the American economy, on consumer prices, on small business success, has been very, very clearly demonstrated between April and now. And so a number of the Republicans who told me, if it turns out that the economic destruction is as you suggest, I'm likely to be with you going forward. I think we will get Republican senators on this vote in October, in addition to the 4 Republicans who voted with us in April.
And do you think there's any chance the Supreme Court agrees with you that these are not powers the president has?
Yes, and to be kind of technical, Rosemary, my challenge in Congress is different than the Supreme Court challenge. My challenge in Congress is there is no emergency with Canada, none. Right. I have to go head on. Is there an emergency with Canada, our greatest trading partner, our ally in every war since the War of 1812? Is there an emergency with Canada? And the answer to that is no. The Supreme Court case is a different one, which is even if there were an emergency, let's just accept that. Even in an emergency, does this statute give the president the right to impose tariffs? The statute does specifically allow the president to do some things if there's an emergency, but it doesn't mention tariffs. And there's a long sort of judicial tradition that if Congress is going to defer a power, delegate a power that's a congressional power, and tariffs and trade matters are, you have to be specific about that delegation. Since the IEEPA statute says nothing about tariffs, the argument before the Supreme Court is even if you accept the emergency, the president can impose tariffs once declaring it.
Let's go back to USMCA, or CUSMA, as Canada calls it right now. The negotiations, if they get restarted, are around sectoral tariffs, but the government is, hoping that CUSMA will continue. What do you think is the likelihood of that?
It has to for the good of our economies. That this is, President Trump wrongly thinks he can wield these tariffs and wield these, trade threats, and it's going to affect others and not going to affect us. Look, I live in Virginia. We export $6.6 billion a year of goods and services to Canada, 3.5 in goods, 3.1 billion in services. Canadian tourists are a huge part of the Virginia economy. This trade war is a self-inflicted wound on the American economy. So we've got to get back to the table. And remember, as you know, that USMCA or CUSMA, it was a great accomplishment of President Trump's first term. It passed in the Senate, I think it was about 90-10, and we don't get that kind of vote for a Mother's Day resolution anymore. So he should own the fact that he achieved this great breakthrough in a comprehensive trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. And yes, after 5 years, we can improve it. But it would be foolish to let an ad on TV cause him to walk away from something that truly was a Trump accomplishment.
Maybe let's just end on this. So the talks are over right now, and the last time Donald Trump did this, Canada had to pull something off the table. It was the digital services tax, which I know Democrats and Republicans both had issues with. What do you think can get him back to the table this time?
You know, I really think, Rosemary, the thing that gets him back to the table is less likely to be a Canadian negotiating move. What's going to get him back to the table is the undeniable economic reality. We had a assessment of the Virginia economy last week by 3 prominent Virginia universities, and they talked about the plummeting GDP growth in Virginia because of Trump's policies, including tariffs. And their conclusion was fewer jobs, higher prices, slower growth. That reality will cause more Republicans to vote with me against tariffs, I believe. That will factor into the Supreme Court's assessment of the wisdom of this policy. It factors into the markets. These things will get Donald Trump and his team back to the table, in my view.
Senator Tim Kaine, thank you very much for making the time.
I think the frustration has built up over time. I've been involved in some of these negotiations, and the Canadians have been very difficult to negotiate with. And you look at all the countries around the world that we've made deals with, and the fact that we're now negotiating with Mexico separately reveals that it's not just about one ad.
That was the director of the U.S. Economic Council, Kevin Hassett, on the president's abrupt end of trade negotiations with Canada in response, of course, to this ad we've been talking about from the Ontario government, featuring the words of President Ronald Reagan. Sources have told CBC News the move by the president caught the government by surprise, and that's where we will start with our American Roundtable. Francesca Chambers is a White House correspondent for USA Today, and Tamara Keith is a senior White House correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. Both join me from Washington. Nice to see you both. Appreciate you making the time. I'll start with, I'm going to start with the ad because we're talking to you from Canada, and then circle back to something that's happened between the U.S. and China. Francesca, it's hard to understand what's going on here, so maybe you can try and explain it. Do you think it was about the ad? Because the president talked about it earlier in the week and then didn't really react until a couple of days later.
Well, and then he said when he was on Air Force One, leaving to go to Asia, that he thought that he would just leave the trade negotiations or the, where they were now, that maybe, or rather he would just leave the agreement in place or the reciprocal tariffs in place that he has already. And so then you see him turn to saying he's going to put a 10% additional tariff on Canada. It's unclear whether or not that would apply to all Canadian goods or just those that aren't covered under the USMCA. It's also notable that this morning, when the Treasury Secretary was asked about this on television, he said he's been in these China talks. And so he wasn't even sure what it is that the president had in mind for this. And so all of this is still, I think, really, fluid. And it's unclear, to be honest, whether or not it would even happen, because we know that the president likes to throw these sorts of things out to have leverage in negotiations.
So Tamara, I wonder, is it because it was the words of Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, sort of used against Donald Trump? I know he said it's AI and it's made up, but it's not. It's all true. These are all things that Ronald Reagan said. So do you think that sort of was the part that irritated him the most?
Yeah, these are all things that Ronald Reagan did say in a 1987 radio address. It was selectively edited, let's be clear, but these are things that Ronald Reagan said. Ronald Reagan is a Republican icon. I think the other thing is that the president kept seeing these ads because they played during the World Series. And in fact, I was watching the World Series last night, and I saw the ad again. And so he is someone who consumes a lot of television, who likes sports, and this is coming directly to him, and it's an annoyance. And we know through like any number of other examples that he really goes on instinct, he goes on emotion, and it's all very personal for him. And so this happened.
So here we are. Francesca, let's go back to what you alluded to there, and that is a deal with China. It seems as though there's a framework of a trade deal between the U.S. and China, and Trump's set to meet with President Xi later this week. How big a deal is this? What do you know?
Yeah, and sometimes when U.S. officials are very optimistic, of course, you have to question that level of optimism about getting a deal. But what I do think matters here this morning is that you did have Scott Bessent coming out on multiple networks saying that there was this framework, saying that he doesn't believe at this point that they'll even get to the November meeting they were supposed to have with the Chinese to determine whether or not they kick the can down the road again on imposing these tariffs, that he believes that they have a deal on soybeans. He also said export controls were something that they believe that they have achieved here, and that they wanted to set the table for President Trump and Xi to meet on Thursday and really hammer out the details of this. It always seemed to be the case that President Trump wouldn't meet with President Xi unless there was something specific to talk about rather than talking about things still. So this may be truly a case where they'll come out of this with some sort of agreement in hand.
Tamara, I'm going to try and get both of these issues in. So I'm going to ask you about the ballroom, because I know you've done a lot of reporting on it. First of all, it's kind of stunning to me that a president is allowed to do this, just tear down a part of the White House in order to build something else there. What is this about? Is this about leaving his imprint on the White House? Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, this tearing down part of the White House is very much in line with the way President Trump has governed in this second term, which is act first and ask permission later, but don't actually ask permission. Yeah. And so he's doing that. And for him, the ballroom is actually an issue that goes back at least to 2010, when he pitched the Obama White House to build a ballroom, because state dinners are being held in tents on the South Lawn because there's only capacity for about 200 people seated in the White House itself. He's a builder. He is somebody who has in numerous ways already tried to put a permanent stamp on the White House, a Trump brand, if you will, changing the Rose Garden, paving it over to be more like his Mar-a-Lago club, putting gold on everything. And so this ballroom is part of that. The White House does insist that this 90,000 square foot ballroom will be all privately funded, which does raise some ethical red flags because many of those funding it have business before the government. But the White House says that the East Wing will be restored and modernized and built back in addition to this massive ballroom.
Okay, and so at the same time as that's happening, Francesca, in South America, there are strikes on what the White House calls cartel members smuggling drugs off the coast of Venezuela, and some concern that this could escalate into a war, a conflict. Is this something that Americans think is a good idea? What does the White House say about this?
Well, it's certainly something that's raising red flags for members of Congress, including members of the president's own party. We just heard a couple days ago, James Langford, a Republican senator, say that he thought that President Trump needed to request permission from Congress for this. And I know you said you'd be speaking to, I believe, Tim Kaine on the program as well today. Yeah. He's someone who's pushed, as a Democrat, very aggressively throughout his time in Congress for presidents to have to come to Congress for the legal authority to be able to have these kinds of strikes or have any sort of military engagement. And so this is drawing in members from both parties at this point, saying that President Trump, at the very least, should go to Congress and ask for permission. Of course, we've seen presidents, they never want to do that because they don't want to have a situation where it's Congress dictating to them what they can do when it comes to using the military. So there's always this tension.
Yeah, it'll be that's a whole other. We could do just a whole panel on what's happening down there. Francesca Chambers, Tamara Keith, thank you. Out of time. Appreciate you both being here, though, and speaking to Canada.